Perfect. I think we can get started now. So hi everyone, my name is Chanel Blackwood and I am the marketing manager at IHEA. Welcome and thank you for registering for today's workshop, Developing Context Relevant and Inclusive Course Outlines and Reading Lists. Today's workshop will run for approximately 90 minutes and will be recorded and uploaded on the IHEA website afterwards. Before we begin today, I wanted to run through a couple of housekeeping items. If you experience any technical issues during today's session, please write them into the chat box at the bottom of the screen. I'll happily assist. Everyone on the line has been muted to eliminate background noise except for our speakers today. We'll be holding all questions until the end of the session, until we open for facilitated Q&A. There will be moments where you can put your questions into the chat box and interact throughout the session. If English is not your first language, we do have a service called Wordly that's located at the top of your menu. You'll see a live button that's red and Wordly. If you click there, you can drop down and select live stream. From there, please select the language of your choosing. I will also put these instructions into the chat box so you can follow along while we get started. If you are joining from a mobile phone today, I do ask that you instead copy the Wordly link that is in the top of the menu and to put it into your browser instead, just to avoid any complications. From here, I'm going to pass things over to Di. Di, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to check if I'm on mute, but I'm not. Welcome to the second of our series of workshops to strengthen capacity for health economics teaching. My name is Di McIntyre, and I'm one of the conveners of the Teaching Health Economics Special Interest Group. I'm just going to begin with showing one slide that was used in the first workshop, which was on it provided an overview of the development and implementation of courses. And basically, if you missed that workshop, it provided an overview, but also focused quite a bit on how do you develop good learning outcomes. If you happen to miss that workshop, the recording can be found on the IHEA website at that address. So this is the second workshop, and we're going to be focusing on session topics and reading lists. And the only thing really to point out from this slide is the importance when doing that of being clear on the target group who is actually going to be attending the course and what your learning outcomes are. And you can see where the other workshops that we've got lined up sort of fit in. So as I said, today we're focusing on session topics and reading lists and curriculum content. And we've got a great panel who are going to engage with you around these issues. I won't go through all the bios just to save time, but just to briefly say that Jolene Scordis will facilitate the discussions. Lucy Irvin will later in the workshop provide a brief presentation on diversity and inclusiveness in curricula and speak about the University College London experience of decolonizing their curricula. Neha Batura and Jane Schumer, as well as Lucy, will provide insights from their experience of developing new courses or revising curricula from an inclusivity perspective, and will engage around your questions and comments. So it's going to be a very interactive session, very little in the way of presentations. Please post questions in the chat box, etc. So just before handing over to Jolene, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and we wanted you to actually kick us off on the discussions by answering a couple of questions. So Chanel, if you could share the the Jamboard screen, and you will see in your in the chat box there will be a link. So Chanel, I don't know if you can post the link to Chatboard, to the chat box, but everyone will get the link posted. There we go. If you look in the chat box, you'll see a link to Jamboard, and you can log in yourself to into the Jamboard. And we're posting 3 questions in the chat box. And what we would like you to do, okay, there the questions are, is to contribute your ideas on those questions. I'm going to hand over to Chanel to just explain how you do that using sticky notes. And then Jolene is going to take over and facilitate the rest of the workshop. So thank you very much, everyone. Chanel, if you could just show us briefly how to post sticky notes.
Perfect, thanks, Di. So once you have arrived onto the Jamboard screen, as I said, I have posted the link into the chat. You can just click on it or copy and paste it into your browser. On the left-hand side, you'll see a menu, and there is a little piece of paper with the corner folded up. That is your sticky note option. So you just click on it there, and the sticky note will pop up. You can type your answer or your contribution onto the sticky note and press save. Once you press save, the sticky note will populate, and then you can drag it and drop it under one of the 3 categories. So very simple to use. You can alter the size and do as many of these as you like. Okay. Di, over to you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to actually, I thought I clicked on the link, and I don't seem to be able to access the sticky notes.
Yeah, so just to say, I can't find the sticky notes either. I
Okay.
I don't have the left-hand side menu.
All right, I just adjusted it to
Okay, great, thank you.
editor. I think everyone should be able to edit now.
Great, I'll go back in and check.
Give that a try.
Just going to refresh it. And there it is, great. So for those of you who might have gone in promptly on time, you do need to hit refresh on Google now so you can get the new settings. And should the ideas be popping up here automatically, Chanel?
Yes, they should be. So if anyone is putting ideas onto the Jamboard, even as a test, we can go through that.
Okay.
The function is working now. There we go.
Great, thank you. Okay. It's really great to see these evolving. Thank you to everyone who's putting up thoughts. For those of you who've tried this before, do consider also what challenges you might have experienced. Great, I see our first challenge coming up. It's really useful. I'll put some of mine into. Thank you. I can see we've still got some thoughts and ideas coming in. This is really evolving now. It's wonderful to see. Right, so now we have 3 quite clear columns. Are there any final thoughts? Should we give it another minute and just let anyone who's formulating a final thought or idea? Okay, it looks like we've got material to go with. If you do feel you can add ideas as we start discussing, great. I'm seeing some additional thoughts come in. Thank you for that. I do love people's Google names. We have Anonymous Kiwi and a couple of other fun things. Great. Oh gosh, so what's pretty clear just from looking at this is the extent of the challenges we've all experienced. So maybe we will make sure that we spend a bit of time on that, because what's clear is this isn't easy, right? Those of us who've tried to do it or are facing trying to do it for the first time might have been a bit daunted, might still feel like we haven't completely cracked it. But let's work together on going through these 3 topics, if that's all right with you. Now, I'm going to start with what's probably the easier section, is how to decide on topics. And I really would invite you all to, oh great, we've got some additional comments coming in. I would invite you all to please do unmute and speak. So do join in this conversation. If anything that I say doesn't chime with your own experience or conflicts with your own experience, or if you've had the same experience yourself, do put your hand up, because I think it's really useful to use this context and this group today to share our experience of trying to do this. And really the hardest, can I ask for a show of hands? Let's see how that will work. How many of you are currently trying to develop modules or courses from scratch? So there's no existing content, you're not adapting content, you've got a blank piece of paper and you're trying to do this. Could you put a hand up using the reactions option? Okay, so there are no hands up. So I assume everyone is starting with some basis for development. Do tell me if I've got that wrong, or if you just didn't have the time to put your hand up. So, okay, so when the very first block of how to decide on the topic is to look at other curricula. And of course, some of the other curricula may in fact be your own home department's curricula. So you don't have a blank piece of paper. You've got what's done in the past. How many of you, where you're using existing curricula, have student feedback on that curricula? Can we just get a show of hands? Do you have any sense of what has or hasn't worked in the past? Or pop a comment in the chat box if you think that would be easier. Right, so it looks as though you've all got some basis on which to start, but you've got, in terms of structure, potentially, but you've got no sense of what does and doesn't work in your context. That can be pretty daunting. You don't know what the good stuff is, what the bad stuff is. Now, frequently, what we've done on our team is, if you're doing something new for the first time, there might be some obvious changes, but we often recommend run it first. Do it the way it was done in the past, and then decide which wheels to reinvent. But when I say do what's obvious to change, what do I mean there? So you might want a mix of methodology and also practical examples. Thank you for whoever put up that. You might look at the student's profession and academic background. Now, that's a really important one, because if you're using some conventional academic content that might have been designed for students who've been in higher education, for this amount of time, then we sorry, I'm slightly distracted by chat coming in, but I'll manage to do that in a moment. Then we will, you'd want to change that to, if you're doing a professional course with people who are actually working as sort of frontline health economists or doing HTA. You could use textbooks to guide you, and it's really useful to see that someone is facing just this now with a starting point of an existing course and discussing with others what the key outcomes should be before leading those topics. And I think on this point, it'd be really useful to get Jane and Nea's inputs into how they have, because they've both recently, if you don't mind me speaking for you, Nea and Jane, have both recently had to adapt existing courses for use either by new groups of students or existing groups of students, but for future years to improve on what's been done. Jane, may I invite you to come in first, and then we'll move across to Nea.
Okay, thanks everyone, and good afternoon, good morning. Yeah, so I was involved in developing a course, a health economics course at the University of Nairobi. It's not that recent though, it could be like around 10 years or so, but anyway, I believe the experience is still valuable. I think I will start by talking about the target, because Diadide pointed out about the outcome. And when we started developing the course at the University of Nairobi, actually, our target was economics graduates. So people with at least a bachelor's in mainstream economics. And we started also by looking at other curricula, University of York, University of Cape Town, all sorts of courses. But as we were developing the course, it became very clear that if we wanted to also achieve a critical mass of health economists in the country, we had to redefine our target. And so we changed, even if we had started by thinking about economists, we had to change and think about other, health system professionals. So I want to highlight the issue of flexibility and reflecting as you develop the course in terms of what do you want to achieve and how are you going to go there. So in addition to the learning objectives, we also had an objective of building a critical mass of health economists in Kenya and in the East African region. So we kind of expanded the audience. What that meant is that we changed the curricula from being very theoretical and economics heavy to being very applied, that even people who did not have, basic economics could actually understand the concepts and be able to apply them. So that was very, very important. The other thing that we looked at was the context in terms of where the country and where the region was in terms of health economics, in terms of the health system challenges that we were experiencing, and looking at how we can we could make the course, practical to address, the key challenges that we were facing as a region. Of course, the country is important, but the country exists within a region. So that did help us a lot in terms of making the course very, very practical. Of course, the issue of looking at other people's curricula is very, very important, as we have mentioned. But you would find, you'll definitely find very beautiful and well thought out curricula, but you really have to contextualize. For example, as I said, and I don't know anymore, it's 10 years down the line, if you take a curricula for York and you take for UCT, you'll see that clearly they are targeting different audiences, and you have to kind of make sure that you are borrowing whatever is applicable. Definitely for the theories, the theories of health economics or whatever theories you are going to apply. It's going to cut across the board. But when it comes to applying the theories, then that's where you need to kind of tweak some of the content that you have borrowed. Maybe I can stop there for now and give Neha a chance also to contribute. Thank you, and over.
Thanks very much, Jane. Yes, Neha, it would be great to hear from you.
I think so. I don't know how much more I can add to what's already on the board, because I think those are really good ways to decide topics. But it's two things that do stand out. One is to know who your target audience is, or who your target student group is, as Jane also mentioned, because that would help you think about, well, what level of knowledge and training do they already come in with, and how you build on that so you can choose your topics accordingly. Or you think about, well, if they are statisticians who are doing a health economics course, how do you need to tailor the choice of topics to make sure that you are bridging the gap that's between people who are previously trained in that subject or completely new student groups. So that's one thing that we certainly found very, very useful, because at our MSc in health economics at UCL, it's not necessary for students to have an economics background. They do need to have a quantitative background. So we also have mathematicians, statisticians, engineers who haven't done any economics before. So part of our challenge was to bridge that gap between economists and non-economists who are looking for a postgraduate qualification in health economics. So it was really useful for us to think about who our students were and what their background was. The other thing that really helped us think about selecting topics for a particular course or module was to see how that module fits in with the other modules in the program. Is it a prerequisite to more advanced modules? That helped us not only choose the topics, but think about how intensive the course needed to be in terms of theory, or would it need to be slightly more balanced between theory and practical applications? And also think about how we represent different global perspectives within that course, because we've got a diverse student body, we've got a diverse range of instructors and lecturers and tutors, and it's important that we reflect that in the choice of topics and the mix between theory and practical application. I think that's it from me.
Wonderful, thank you. I think at this point, it'd be really good to ask if there are any questions. Both Jane and Neha have given quite detailed examples of how they've begun to decide on topics. Do any of our participants today have questions? Now's your chance to ask, to get some experienced input. Either pop a question in the chat or pop your hand up. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in, but do feel free to put some questions in if they occur to you as we go along, because I'm now going to move on to the reading materials, if that's okay. And finding reading materials can be particularly challenging. So let's have a look at some of the sticky notes that we've got on the board. So blogs can sometimes be very helpful. Absolutely, they can bring the topic alive a bit. Papers and texts, themed issues of journals can be very good. New journal articles, someone's got a folder to add these to, possibly for teaching all year round. What a wonderful way of keeping up to date. Textbooks, preprints and blog posts, policies and papers, all incredibly useful. I'm going to sound one small warning call about blog posts, and this is purely for those of you teaching students of, so not professional students, but students on a more academic track. We often find it quite difficult to get students to really engage with the academic literature and to formulate nuanced arguments. And I can spot from a kind of 10 paces students who've only used blogs And blogs can be from anyone at any point and be quite ranty. And you can absolutely see it in the arguments if students have used blogs to formulate their discussion, because blogs aren't always evidence-based. So I think if you're using blogs, that's great. Use them to provoke debate. Use them to question evidence sources. So use them, but use them well and carefully would be my suggestion on that. Textbooks are really helpful. I'm not sure what your experience is, but I find students coming into economics are often very nervous about economics. The discipline has been placed on possibly an undeserved pedestal, and textbooks give them a real structure and a reassurance that there is something solid. And if they go from the first page to the last page, they'll get through it, and they've got a table of contents and they can tick things off. So having everything contained in one place is very useful. But of course, for the most part, textbooks tend to be oriented towards the theoretical and not so much the empirical or the applied. So I suspect the real art is in using those textbooks to get the fundamental concepts across, using them for a really clear set of graphs or really clear set of conceptual or theoretical explanations, and then bringing in really nice applied papers, recent examples. And if you've got a folder going, like one of our participants has a folder going of really nice, neat papers that they've come across, then you've got a good combination. We also find with our reading materials, just as a tip, and then I'm going to hand back again to Naya and Jane, that we have to be careful of overloading students. They're trying to absorb an enormous amount of content, often quite quickly. Many students might also be working at the same time, so be sensitive to that. And we find sort of more than 2 or 3 core readings per session is overload. So perhaps what you might want to do is combine a theoretical textbook chapter with a nice applied paper as the core required readings, but then don't be shy of giving them a recommended reading list that isn't compulsory and that you can give them loads of links to at the bottom. So there's lots of opportunity for students to get their teeth into something that they're excited about and read and read and read. But be careful of making that a requirement for passing the module or the course, because I think at that point students can quite easily feel overfaced. We do need to be a bit gentle with them if we want to take them along on this journey and ensure that they have deep learning on what we're trying to teach. I'm going to pause there. Naya, should we start with you this time and see if you've got any additional reflections on reading materials, and then Jane will move across to you.
Sure, thanks, Jolene. I mean, these are really fabulous suggestions on where to source reading materials from. There's one sticky note that says preprints. And I'd like to begin, as Jolene did, with a slight cautionary tale to say that preprints aren't peer reviewed in yet. And so I would be slightly cautious of putting them on a reading list unless it's with the understanding that the students will be explained the difference between a preprint and a final published journal article. With respect to what sorts of reading materials, it's always nice to have a mix, maybe even from, even if it's journal articles from different types of journals, because different journals sometimes have different scopes. Some might be quite policy oriented, and so they'll have a different spin on a certain research question. Some of them might be quite methods oriented, and then the content of that paper, while on the same topic, would be slightly different. So having a mix of different types of journal articles on the same topic also lends diversity. It also helps address the fact that different students learn differently and are interested in different aspects of the same topic. And so it helps to have that sort of diversity within reading materials as well. And of course, as Jolene said, it's important not to overload them. And if you've got, what we found helpful is if you have a lecture, to sometimes use examples from the reading materials just to flag to students, how everything sort of links up or how there might be conflicting points of view. Yes, I think I'll stop there because I do have a tendency to kind of ramble about these things.
You don't ramble at all. You share your experience, which is what we're here for, and it's really appreciated, Naya. Thank you. But I will hand over to Jane, if you don't mind, for your ramblings.
Yeah, thanks. Nothing much to add, but I think to emphasize the importance of having an essential list, because students tend to get very, very overwhelmed. There's a lot of literature out there, so it's really helpful to be able to sort this literature. I think the other key thing is to, as much as possible, give them experiences from different regions on the same topic, because the challenges that are being faced in one part of the world are not necessarily the same, so that students have a feel in terms of how different contextual contexts affect some of the health system outcomes that you are interested in. So I think that's a lot of it has been said. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. Lucy, I'm very conscious that we've got a section at the end for you to talk to us about decolonizing the curriculum, but it just feels remiss to not bring you in on choosing the reading materials and some considerations for context specificity. I know it's going to come up again in the challenges, but do you have any thoughts that you would like to add at this stage?
Thanks, Gillian. Yeah, absolutely. I will sort of reflect on this again a bit later, but I think what we found in sort of trying to decolonize the curriculum work at IGH is that there's a sort of tension between trying to ensure you have broad representation on your reading list, perhaps, from quite small or local journals that might not come up easily or might not be well known, and also sort of covering the key texts that are already kind of a sort of central part of the curriculum, whilst not kind of putting those on a pedestal and just repeating that these are the kind of the go-to and the kind of the sort of mainstream theories or ideas or thinkers or writers that we should be kind of replicating again and again and not moving on from. So that's definitely something. So one of the modules I lead on is quite different to economics, but I teach an anthropology of global health module. And so something we've really been struggling with, but trying to do in that is kind of find a balance between those two things. So making sure we do cover the kind of key, historically key anthropological thinkers, and also bringing in new thinkers who might not sort of be well represented on sort of traditional curriculum. But yeah, it's difficult to find sometimes. There are some really good sort of research and publishing networks. So I think once you can sort of tap into those, there's a great one in Brazil, which is where my research is, where anyone in Brazil can kind of join this network and publicize their research on it. So you don't have to kind of get into a mainstream journal to get at least people aware of it. So I think things like that, if you can kind of identify sort of local or national research and publishing networks as well, is quite a good way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lucy. That's really useful. And in the meantime, Di has also posted a really important question into the chat. But can I invite all of our participants to put your hand up or put a comment into the chat if you'd like it addressed before we move away from the reading materials and onto the challenges. So to spend a little bit of time on Di's question, for those of you who might not be able to see the chat, Di says most textbooks are written in the US or somewhere in Europe. Are they necessarily appropriate for courses in LMICs, given that priorities for content of focus is different in different countries? Or even is a US textbook relevant in the European context? Now, that's a really good question, and one for which I would argue there isn't a very clear answer. One of the ways in which US textbooks in my teaching in Europe are completely inappropriate is on the emphasis in insurance and the role of private markets, which in Europe, there is very little insurance, or the structure of insurance is completely different to the US context. And the role of private markets is really a non-issue. However, I have found that still teaching that content does help us to think through some core theoretical concepts like risk pooling, financial pooling. So the kinds of concepts you might still want to get across at a conceptual or theoretical level, but you would, as teachers of this content, need to be very clear about the differences between other contexts and the one in your own, and how this might apply in other places, but not in your own. And of course, the idea that LMICs all have the same sort of context isn't right either. You know, we've got very mixed markets in some LMICs and very small private sector in other LMICs. So lots of differences. I suppose what I would argue, and I'd love to hear others' thoughts on this, please do put your hand up, is that when it comes to theory, it shouldn't be very context specific. When it comes to bringing it alive and applying it to your context, or applying it to how your audience might be using that theory, that's when you run into context. And that is the art form of developing truly alive modules. Any other thoughts on that? Would anyone disagree with me or agree with me? Love to see some thoughts in the chat or some hands up. Stella, great to have your hand up. Thank you. Please go ahead with your question when you're ready. We can't hear you just yet, so if you're speaking, it looks as though you're speaking, but we can't hear you. Oh dear, what a pity when we've got someone actually brave enough to ask a question. So first of all, well done for trying. Do you want to pop a note in the chat, maybe? Thanks, Stella. Do we have anybody else who would like to? You see, even if the tech lets us down, we'll still give you the space to ask your question. Right, in which case we will move on to the challenges while Stella writes her thoughts into the chat. Stella, we are going to move very slowly to make sure that you are heard and answered. I don't want to put Stella in the awful position of having to both write and listen at the same time to do different things. It causes my brain to short circuit. I know we're all supposed to be kings and queens of multitasking these days. Yes, oh, no, I can see Naya shaking her head. It's supposedly a societal trait. Oh, we've got a question from Eric. Eric says, agreed, theories might not be context specific. I use journal articles for application of theories to local context. So fantastic, Eric. Yes, thank you. And that's really, it's that combination of textbooks give you quite dry theory, which shouldn't really be context specific. Although in order to bring it alive and to move beyond the basic graphs or the basic concept, you need to really try and, oh, thanks, Stella. Stella's saying we should go ahead and she'll write. We need to try and bring it alive. And of course, if you're in a context that is well studied, so those of you based in South Africa, it's a relatively well studied environment, and there are some nice papers that you might be able to access. Jane, do you find the same in Kenya?
Yes, at the moment, yes. But when we were starting, there was very, very little. So we did a lot of borrowing from countries that were experiencing similar challenges. But I think for anyone doing it now, they will drown in literature on Kenya.
Nice problems to have, huh? No, and that's interesting because I've been in this field for a couple of decades now, and the difference in the availability of context-specific studies and studies from a wide range of low and middle income countries is really notable. It's fantastic because we're getting country-specific, population within country-specific, and disease within country-specific papers coming out, which means that for some contexts, you should have lots of opportunities to draw on. In others, where there's still a head of steam being built up, do feel free to use appropriate neighbours as examples. And that really will be your art form as the teacher to think about whether that's relevant in your context and to bring in examples from neighbouring countries. Nea, great to see your hand up.
I just wanted to comment on what Eric is saying, is to use journal-specific articles in addition to the theory. I mean, theory doesn't always hold in a context, doesn't it? And empirical evidence to show that this theory or this model doesn't work in this context is actually incredibly useful. And then you could probably use that to kind of, do what Di is sort of nudging us to do, is to think about a textbook that's appropriate for diverse contexts, where you've got a mix of people, of mechanisms, of health systems, of sort of all these things that are moving quite dynamically and changing because of new policies and new recommendations. So I really like that, and that's what we do for a lot of our modules here within the MSc, is that we'll have a theoretical chapter, and then we'll have lots of examples either in the lecture or as part of the reading list, sometimes both, to see whether those theories hold in that context or they don't.
Great. Yes, absolutely. And Lucy, did you want to add to that or extend the thought? Sorry, Lucy, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, sorry. Just to build on that slightly from what I can remember from studying health economics quite a while ago. But I was sort of thinking about also how context changes not only sort of from place to place, but over time, and how some sort of theoretical models might become, well, need to adapt, or kind of no longer be applicable as sort of technology develops and sort of our sort of well, with globalization more generally, but particularly technology, I was thinking. So yeah, I think kind of being aware of how context can show that these models kind of need to adapt to development as well as sort of geographical or cultural context.
Thank you, Lucy. That's incredibly useful. Okay, I'm going to use our last 5 minutes of this session to touch on the challenges. And we really do only need 5 minutes because we have already raised these challenges. These challenges are relevant to the reading material and the content development. And after that, I'll hand over to Lucy and there'll be a clear segue through. So we've already talked about the challenges of bringing it alive. So using the textbooks, which might be a little more abstract or theoretical, using journal articles to really bring it alive. The difficulty of accessing some of the literature we might go into, we'll go into in a minute. And but the balance between theory and application, I think we've already discussed and talked about how complementary they are and how that can often be quite difficult to negotiate in really condensed reading lists. If you can only have 2 readings, definitely make one of each theoretical and applicable. There's a question about what is the right number of readings for each subject, and I think we've touched on that already. Always err on the side of slightly too few is required, and then be generous in what you offer as a guided reading list for optional readings outside. Do make sure, though, that your exam or assessment questions really only require the required readings. Don't assume that everyone's gone off and read the non-essential reading lists. That would be unfair to your students. Okay, too much, keeping it current. Gosh, that's a huge challenge, because I don't know about you, but I find our topic really interesting and I want students to know all about it. But really, you can't teach, in a way, you can't teach too little. We've really got to aim for depth and not breadth in much of our teaching, so that students can properly understand what they're doing. Because once they've got depth on some concepts, they can extend outwards from there. Whereas if all they've got is a superficial understanding of some basic ideas, there will be no extension from them. And that's really what the teaching literature tells us about learning pedagogy theory. So we've got another comment on considering context appropriateness and assumptions of data availability. I think we've touched on that, and the use of journal articles from either your own or neighbouring context to try to address that. I've got to find some way of, Chanel, could you make this any bigger at all? Even with my glasses, I can't read some of these. That small pink one. Yes, great. Mainly that I'm new to this. Oh gosh, do you know what? After 20 years of doing it, I still feel new to it. I wouldn't feel badly at all. Every cohort of students is a new cohort of students. So every year is a new opportunity to get it right or wholly mess it up. I just wouldn't feel too worried about it. Go in with your love of your subject and your students will get that and they will enjoy learning from you, because I bet you've got experience and otherwise you wouldn't be offered the opportunity to teach it. Bring that experience, bring your enjoyment of your subject, and your students will come along with you. Drawing in relevant examples from areas you're not very familiar with yourself. Do you know, I just tell students if it's not my main area, I say, look, I've read this really interesting paper or seen this interesting thing. It's not my main area, but what do you think? Allow your students to be the experts too occasionally, or say, I can refer you on to people, or why don't you do some reading and come back to me? I think the idea that we as teachers need to be experts in everything is actually quite an old-fashioned idea. And I've very seldom found students expect me to know it all. So I wouldn't feel too worried about not knowing everything. I'm going to end on just commenting on the accessibility of some literature. In the same way that Jane mentioned, there is more and more context-specific literature. Thank goodness, more and more of it is open access. So it is becoming increasingly easy to access literature, but that's not always the case. And one of the things I'd like to say is in the past, when I've had difficulty accessing literature, I've relied on colleagues to send me interesting papers. So don't feel afraid of using your network if you've come across something really fascinating that you would like to read. And they will, I'm sure, be a sort of straight up and appropriate way of getting hold of it through the system. So do use your friends, do use your network. We are all here to support one another. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Nair and Jane for any last quick comments before Lucy takes over. Thank you. Jane, do you want to start?
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to talk about one of the challenges that we faced was developing appropriate case studies that will help the students to be able to understand what you have really taught. I think most people do struggle with the case studies, and in my opinion, they are as important as what you've already taught. And we did kind of look at things from other settings, discuss with some other colleagues, tried to work through the case studies ourselves and so forth. Oh, Dai just says that the next workshop is on case studies. So yeah, I'm sure you'll get to hear more of it, but it was really a big challenge for us when we were, thinking about teaching. Thank you.
Thanks, that's great. Nair, any final thoughts?
I think it's just to remember that when you start a new course, or either from scratch or take it over from someone, it's not that when you've invested that time in the beginning that then you're done. Every year you refresh reading lists, you look at student evaluations, who often say things like, oh, I don't understand how this topic fits in with the learning objectives, or how this tutorial exercise extends that learning, And these are actually quite useful, because it's this constant feedback loop that we're getting that helps us improve course structure, reading lists, and I found that incredibly helpful. I mean, every summer I sit down and revamp at least 50% of topics and content and reading lists. So it never stops. It's ongoing. It's enjoyable because you do keep it relevant. It helps to bring in some of your own research because it's interesting to you. It's an application of a theory. And if you're excited about teaching something that is personal to you, it's interesting for students. They really feed off of our energy. And that's one of the things that can also bring things alive in a classroom.
Thank you so much, Nair. I don't want to ignore, we're out of time for this session, and I hope you've all got an enormous amount out of it. I certainly have. Stella has asked a question that I'd like to address, but can I suggest, Lucy, that you get your slides up and ready to go while I address Stella's question? Thank you so much, so that we can smooth the segue through. So Stella, you've talked about the different contexts, great, but the bigger question that hasn't been addressed in the other discussion is what to do with a mixed audience of everything from non-economists to erudite economists. And I would strongly suggest start at the beginning. You'd be amazed how much basic theory erudite economists have forgotten. They've all gone into their applied area. And I've often had quite advanced economists on my intro course, and they come up afterwards saying, so nice to have a refresher on demand and supply. I'd completely forgotten all that stuff. So don't be nervous about keeping it simple. Lucy, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks for inviting me. I'm just going to briefly share some experiences of some of the decolonizing the curriculum work we've been doing at the Institute for Global Health. Okay. So this is the toolkit that I'm going to talk about today as part of some broader processes of decolonizing work. A bit of background, we have a long-standing Black and minority ethnic awarding gap in the Institute of Global Health across the master's and undergraduate modules. And we have a lot of international students. A couple of years ago, 2019, 2020, a group of our Global Health MSc students, as part of their actual coursework, conducted a survey with their own course mates. And this was in response to what they perceived to be a lack of representation in the curriculum, and particularly some concerns around some of the imagery and language used in educational materials, so mostly sort of lecture slides or kind of seminar handouts. So in response to this, and also sort of spurred by global events with the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, Dr. Rochelle Burgess, who's a colleague of mine, myself and these students formed the Decolonizing Global Health Working Group. So we met regularly. It was open to all staff and students, and actually anyone sort of externally as well who happened to come across it and be interested in getting involved. We held a few sort of seminar and speaker events that were open to the public, which were very successful and well attended. And sort of talked about various other activities we could do, including sort of having reading groups and creating blog posts and things like that. But I'm going to focus on the toolkit because this was the sort of one of the main outputs of this group, and so far has sort of, I guess, been one of the most successful things that's come out of it. So it's essentially a very easy to read and easy to use 7-page PDF document, which has been widely shared across our department and is particularly targeted towards teaching staff with the aim of decolonizing the curriculum as a very sort of broad aim. But the idea was to sort of try and break that very broad but important goal down into sort of tangible actions that we could do, concrete examples of the problems and things we could do to address these. So the toolkit was put together by one of the MSc students, Mita Huck, and then Rochelle and I supported her in doing this. So it's organized into 3 thematic areas, which I'm going to now just cover briefly. So accessibility, so this is also one of the sort of, I guess, least tangible things, but very important, we thought to put first. So this is the level at which course material and the learning environment are reachable, approachable, and traversable to all. And this came about because some students reported in the survey I mentioned that they sometimes hesitated in engaging in the classroom due to perhaps perceptions about etiquette in the classroom from their previous educational experiences, especially, you know, if they hadn't previously been in education in the UK, for instance. Also discomfort from being misunderstood by educators. And so some of the examples of these behaviour were that some non-English speaking students said that they felt that the tone of some educators, not all, was could be sometimes condescending, or that they might use sort of culturally specific or generalizing terminology. So in order to address this, the recommendation of the toolkit is to encourage students to ask questions and contribute criticisms and perspective in ways that best suit them. So making that very clear at the beginning of the course, also explaining why and how inquiry and critique is so important in the classroom, and ensuring that all teaching staff, not just course leads, but any sort of postgraduate teaching assistants, for example, are properly trained to kind of facilitate this positive learning environment. So the second theme is misrepresentation. So that is the misaligned verbal and or visual portrayals of people, groups, regions and cultures that often stem from stereotypes or bias. So one of the kind of key examples here was that students in the survey reported too many images of impoverished Black children and frowning women in saris with children on their hip that are used in global health to portray need and adversity. And so the recommendation was to avoid relying on images that portrayed people in this way, instead including empowering or neutral imagery, ensuring that the representation of these people are balanced, so not just having Black, Indigenous and people of colour represented as being in need, and as sort of white or European people as being helping or in power. Also expanding the breadth of case studies and examples used to ensure that examples in the reading list also, but also in your sort of teaching materials, come from all over the world, and in order to maintain a balance of representation, particularly of where there are successes and where there are failures globally, not just kind of reinforcing the kind of outdated kind of colonial dichotomy. And finally, language, the expression of racism and or exclusion through text and speech. So the examples that the students noted in the survey were the use of Africa, very broadly, sub-Saharan Africa, the third world, and the use of generalizing statements about diverse regions or peoples. In order to address this, the recommendations are to be as specific as you can to the country and ethnicities being discussed. One sort of issue that I will reflect on as well is the fact that a lot of these terms are in older literature, or sort of even mainstream literature still. And so it can be quite challenging to kind of explain that to students and try and get them to not use those terms sometimes. But I think that is the responsibility of us as educators, to kind of move away from those terms wherever possible, even if they kind of are reporting or analysing or discussing literature that does use it, they need to indicate that. And instead, ideally using classifications such as high, low, middle income, for example, instead in place of terms such as developing and developed countries, which are less value laden, even if still generalising. And I just wanted to show you an example of what this is just a screenshot of the toolkit itself, just to sort of show you the layout. So I think the really good thing about the toolkit is definitely, not perfect and is still in development, but we really tried to make it practical. So, and kind of very sort of step by step. So we have the kind of ask yourself, as an educator, how does the content provided in your program portray low income communities and communities of colour? Then giving examples at the bottom here of what that I mentioned of the students reported, and then in terms of practice, what you could do to address this, and examples of how you might change this sort of problematic imagery, for instance here. So just some further directions and reflections to conclude. So we initially shared this within the department, and we got a lot of feedback from staff. It was actually really useful. A lot of people saying they were surprised, particularly just in terms of some of the, I think particularly sub-Saharan Africa in some sort of disciplines is quite widely used to describe sort of trends across that region. So people really, responding to that and taking that on board, and we have seen really positive response from teaching staff within the department. There are some challenges around, for instance, if you have a sort of guest speaker coming in, asking them in advance to kind of look at the toolkit and potentially adapt their materials if needed. But that has been usually well responded to as well. So going forward, the toolkit is now being developed further by Rochelle Burgess, and she's received funding to run a pilot implementation. And this is to take the toolkit and take it sort of beyond just the Institute of Global Health and roll it out across the Faculty of Population Health Sciences. So that's being used now across many more degree programs. So she's sort of working on that in order to try and address the Black and minority ethnic attainment gap. And some personal reflections, and these are sort of also things that we discussed quite frequently in the Decolonizing Global Health group. The question of whether it goes far enough and whether just sort of changing images slightly and wording and adding a few slightly better representation on reading lists is superficial. My own view is that it's something at least, and it obviously it's one step in the much longer journey towards the end goal of hopefully decolonizing the curricula completely. So I think it's worth doing, but I think it can't be the kind of be all and end all, and it has to be seen as one step on that journey. And then also, I think we sort of slightly touched on this already, but the value of still understanding why the sort of history of, say, using the term developing world, but problematizing it and discussing it in class, not sort of forgetting that existed, because I think it's an important part of the story, but just making sure that that's the way it's used if it is discussed. And the same for a kind of, I guess, dominant or well-known classical readings. That's all. So yeah, happy to take any questions or reflections on this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I actually think I should be handing back to Di to end this session, because I Di, are you with us? Are you with us?
I am.
I'd like to conclude.
I am.
Thanks
But
so much.
No. We do have. We had set aside 90 minutes, and it seems that people are still engaged. So I think it would be great to actually have some discussion about the presentation that Lucy has given, and also getting Neha and Jane to contribute ideas, because I think it's although it's a specifically around the UCL experience, I think it raises some really, really important issues, and I think it's very relevant to the topics that we cover. What do we prioritize? The balance between theory and application. Some of the issues around reading material. I popped a little thing in the chat box around the textbooks, and part of the reason I raised that question about most of the textbooks are written in the US or Europe is not, yes, the theory that they cover is very often of relevance in any context, but the way in which it's written sometimes does use value-laden language, and also the contextualization that is given to those theories is very much from the US context or the European context. So I think it would, and also thinking about, so we've spoken about articles being used, and particularly to demonstrate some of the application and the empirical side of things. But I think there are things that we should be thinking about in terms of diversity and inclusiveness in the reading lists, around access that people with diverse voices have to publishing in the mainstream journals and the open access. There are issues around reviewing and power structures within some of these journals. And also that there are sometimes charges for, and particularly if it's open access, there are charges for people to actually publish in those journals. So I think there's a whole lot of issues that have been raised. So I would love there to be more discussion. And I just got a 3-minute presentation at the end to let people know about a resource for low and middle income countries to access some of the literature they wouldn't be able to access directly from journals. So please, no, you keep going.
Okay, great. So we've got a question from Linda who says, thanks, Lucy. Could you say more about what was highlighted around the accessibility of reading materials in terms of reachability? Lucy, are you happy to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. Do you mean accessibility in terms of sort of practically, in terms of open access of the reading materials, or a different kind of reachability? Do you mind clarifying?
Hi, Lucy, it's Linda here. Yeah, it was more, we don't have an issue, I believe, about our students accessing materials. Our library's absolutely excellent. Kudos to them. But I think sometimes we struggle to find materials that can be accessed by people. So what I find is then you have this challenge where folks suddenly start quoting things to you and putting a reference as Khan Academy online, which suggests that there's quite a mismatch going on there. And I just wondered, because your slide had said that reachability, and maybe I've misunderstood your slide then.
The reachability, is that in the
under accessibility,
and the learning environment of reachable, approachable. So yeah, I think that is more of a kind of making everybody feel like they are comfortable in understanding, and that the reading materials are kind of relevant to them, as well as the learning environment is a place that they feel they can kind of comfortably contribute to. So yeah, I think again we don't have because we're able to make any materials technically accessible to our students on Moodle, so there isn't a sort of practical issue. I do think there are other issues around perhaps students for whom English isn't their first language, potentially feeling like they can kind of as equally kind of contribute to discussions. That's certainly something that we, I personally sort of do struggle with sometimes. I mean, I definitely, going back to the sort of reading list discussion earlier, try to make sure that the essential readings are broadly representative. So if I've got a very sort of dense, complex, potentially sort of more challenging read, I will try to put in a kind of more applied, accessible reading. I don't sort of, I think there aren't any easy answers when you're trying to cater for a sort of an international class with potentially different levels of experience in that subject. So all I can say is sort of trying to make sure that at least those different needs and abilities are catered for. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, thanks. I think it was that. I think I was just wondering about that struggle sometimes that students have, and I'm very aware that they are operating not necessarily in English as a primary language. So because of that, I'm concerned. Obviously, a lot of textbooks, they're quite, they presume a certain level of maybe understanding or knowledge or competence. And then it's just then how do you help scaffold your students so that they can move towards that? You know, I remember myself in a master's course being told by the lecturer, oh, this blog's really good. It took me something like 16 months of reading it every week until I suddenly thought, oh God, I can actually understand some of this. But prior to that, you know, I just couldn't, and it's kind of stuck with me, and I therefore feel for my students, I guess, because I think, oof, I know what that's like. You've read it, because you were supposed to, but you didn't really get it because it was just a bit too much, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, I suppose that's also sort of a space where seminars can be really useful as well, is kind of really trying, you know, I think you can kind of slightly pick up on if someone's really not contributing in class for over sort of several weeks. And then you can, you know, I would always sort of try and not single them out, but perhaps sort of speak to them afterwards and just check in and make sure that they are kind of understanding, or maybe they're just shy. But yeah, I think that's sort of something that we kind of need to keep an eye on, definitely, without kind of making them feel on the spot or uncomfortable. I don't know if Jolene and Neha and Jane, you have any thoughts on?
Well, I think I'd really like to get Jane and Neha's input on this. And Neha, would you like to start with any thoughts, and then Jane will bring you in?
Sure. So I think I'd like to pick up on what Linda said about scaffolding. You know, on our MSc program, we have an introduction to microeconomics module that is essential for people who don't have an economics background. And that's to bring them up to speed with the students who already have an undergraduate degree in economics before they proceed to an advanced microeconomics for health module. And so the assumption is that by the time you get to the advanced microeconomics module, you should be comfortable with the theoretical models. But not everyone is quantitatively brained in the same way. Some people find it easier to work with sets and matrices, and some people prefer algebra. So what we've actually done for that module is have 2 advanced microeconomics texts, but one feels like slightly more accessible than the other, because there's more time spent on the explanation of the quantitative modules. So in fact, I flagged to students that, you know, I prefer this because this is how I understand things, and this is how this textbook helps me to get those threshold concepts really solid in my brain before I move on to read the advanced book, which frankly speaking is actually quite scary looking. And students have kind of fed back saying, yes, we did find that first book more accessible. It helped us to understand what, you know, the underlying dynamics before we moved on to look at the corresponding mathematical bits in the other textbook. So it might not be possible for every module that works to have kind of scaffolding text, but where it is possible, it might be a good idea to have maybe some background reading for students that explains concepts in really applied, simple ways, maybe not targeted to economists, so that it's super applied and super accessible and not scary.
Yeah, I think moving away from lingo and economics terminology is useful in every sense, because we don't work in silos, we work across disciplines, we have to work in teams, and we forget how much we speak of our own unique language and how alienating that can be. Okay, so I'd love to bring Jane in for a final thought on this session. And then Jane, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to ask you to share a few overall summary points about the session as a whole. So do you want to give any final thoughts on Lucy's presentation and the questions raised so far?
Yeah, just a small one about language. And yeah, of course, in most of our institutions, English is the teaching language. And, you know, when you are offering a course that requires people from different countries, there is always a challenge, even when people pass these exams that are required, in terms of how they present their assignments, their writing styles, and things like that. And of course, what usually happens is that, you know, depending on who is the examiner and, you know, and the culture of the universities, such students tend to, you know, be, or to score perhaps a bit lower. And I think it is very important, and I know that some universities do this, that, there are resources to help these students, but also that this is put into consideration during examinations of their thesis and things like that. We have seen, I have examined thesis that, you look at this thesis, you can see the student is brilliant, has got ideas, but the way they present these ideas is very different from someone who has had quite a bit of experience in working in English. So I think we should also not underestimate how language makes students feel, and in terms of presenting their works, in terms of participation and things like that. Just that small point. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And then Jane, sorry to keep the pressure on you, but it would be really useful. And in fact, Naya, if you're happy to contribute here too, please do feel free to come in. But I think at this point, we've had a really clear discussion using the board on how to start setting up something like this, what reading lists to use, and what challenges we might experience. We've had Lucy talk to us about some of the thinking around being culturally sensitive and decolonizing the curricula and the experiences that we've had at University College London. But it would be useful if, Jane, if you have a couple of points that you want to bring out in summary to reflect on this discussion, and then if you have any additional summary points, that would be useful too. Jane, are you able to turn your video on, Jane, just while you're speaking?
Okay.
Otherwise, we miss out on seeing.
Okay, yeah. So maybe I will just say a few points, and then Neha can add. I think a few key points is, don't start from scratch. A lot has been done. Look at what has been done, but while doing so, note that context matters, and apply these resources in your context. There's a lot there, but let's aim at the depth. Focus on a few topics, and have students understand that a lot of these other things will be learned on the job, so that is critical. And I think another thing is reach out to colleagues, reach out to people who have done this before. I'm happy to hear that AHIA is building a repository where some of these resources will be saved for access by people from low and middle income countries. And finally, don't overwhelm the students with a lot of literature. Prioritize, give them an essential list so that they are able to cover it within the reasonable time. Thanks. Over.
Thanks. Nair, any final thoughts in summary from you?
Thanks. I think I'd just like to pick up on what Jane said last about not overwhelming students with reading, and link that back to Lucy's presentation on inclusivity. I mean, yes, reading lists are supposed to extend the learning that students have had from the lecture and from a seminar, because naturally you can't cover everything about a topic in 2 hours. But I think the other thing that we want our students to come away from after they've completed a module or a particular session is to really think critically about what they've heard and about the discussions that they've been a part of. So the reading list should have and include these different perspectives and points of view, because if we don't read about conflicting ideas, we aren't going to think very critically about that issue. And that's really something, in addition to the hard technical skills, we want our students to come away with. And they can't think critically about an issue, about a topic, about a context, if they don't read about different perspectives, whether that's between countries, within the same countries, a gendered perspective, or a particular ethnic perspective. So I think it's important to think about, well, is my reading list diverse and offering different opinions? And at the same time, there's also a word of caution around that, to not go down a rabbit hole trying to look for different papers by different kinds of authors and things. You can only do what you can do. The evidence base can be limited for a certain topic. And it's just to keep that in mind when you're teaching that particular topic, that look, the evidence base on this is limited, it is skewed. Maybe you're teaching something about private public partnerships in health, and a lot of the literature is coming only from India. I think it's fine to say, look, you'll find that your reading list is filled with examples from India, because this is where most of the research is done, and this is a gap in the research. So it's also giving, as Lucy said, if there's a problem, we have to acknowledge it, but also equip our students to think and engage with those issues so that they can, sort of be inspired to work in those areas or do things differently.
Wonderful. I think that's a really great note to end it on. Thank you so much, Jane, Naya, Lucy, for your really important descriptions of your own experiences and for your guidance in moving forward. Thanks to all of our participants who've submitted questions, comments and thoughts. We're going to end this session with a short presentation from Di on Research for Life. So I'm going to hand over to Di before we wrap up, and thank you all for your attention so far. Di, thank you for getting it up and ready. Over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Jolene. We just wanted to mention Research for Life, which is a resource that may be helpful for people. It was interesting that Linda said there isn't a problem with accessibility in terms of accessing readings within her institution. But in many institutions, the library resources are very limited, the physical and the electronic library resources. So Research for Life, people might have heard of Hinari, which was initially set up by the WHO, and which negotiated with a whole range of publishers, most of the large international publishers, to give free access to journals, and that expanded also to access to chapters and books. Now, Research for Life includes Hinari as well as some other similar initiatives around agriculture, development, etc. And basically what it does is that it allows institutions, whether they're universities, research centers, national libraries, etc., to get access to a large number of non-open access journal articles and books. And there are two categories. It applies only for low and middle income countries, low and lower middle income countries. So not upper middle income countries like South Africa or China. And there's two tiers. The really low income countries in blue have completely free access. The low middle income countries have access. It costs $1,500 per annum for the institution, but that is for like an entire university, and it includes publications on health, agriculture, environment, development and innovation, and global justice. So this was just to mention that if you are struggling to access literature which is not fully open access, you should have a look at the Research for Life website and see if your institution is already registered, because there are thousands of institutions that are registered with Research for Life and already have access. What I found really important in the Research for Life initiative is that academic and teaching staff can make copies of the things that they actually access from Research for Life for their students in print or digital form in course packs. So it's really a valuable resource. The only thing is you can't download a whole book. You can download specific chapters, and you can download certain articles rather than entire journal issues. But my sense is that this is a resource that we should be using more and more, and that it can help to compile relevant, inclusive reading lists for courses. So on that note, I'm going to stop and I think that's the end of the workshop. But just from my side, as one of the coordinators of the conveners of the Teaching Health Economics Special Interest Group, and to also mention that Neha is another convener of the group, and helped put this workshop together. But I hope you found this useful. I really think that the discussion was rich. To thank Jolene for facilitating the discussions, and Neha, Jane, and Lucy for their inputs. And thank you very much to everyone for participating, and hope you have a good rest of the day or evening wherever you were located. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much,
Cheers,
Di.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.